The dusty streets of Medellin were alive with the hum of everyday life, but for a young Pablo Escobar, the city seemed like a blank canvas, waiting for him to leave his mark. He had always been a man of ambition, even in his earliest years, but ambition alone could not have prepared him for the most intoxicating force he would ever encounter: love. It arrived unexpectedly, wrapped in the shy smile of a girl named María Victoria Henao. Pablo first noticed her on a warm afternoon, the sun casting a golden glow on the cobblestone streets, highlighting the innocence in her eyes. She was just 13, delicate and unassuming, yet something about her presence made his heart thump with a strange mixture of fear and desire. She laughed at a joke someone else had made, unaware that the gaze of a man nearly twice her age followed her every move. There was something magnetic about him, too, a quiet confidence, the way he carried himself with a subtle authority that drew attention without effort. It was a dangerous charm, but to Pablo it felt natural, like destiny nudging him forward. Days turned into weeks, and Pablo found himself orchestrating encounters under the guise of casual meetings. Every glance, every brief touch of her hand became a silent conversation, a thread weaving them closer together. He was meticulous, careful to cultivate an image of a gentleman, a protector, someone who could offer her not just love but a future filled with promise. He gave her small gifts, a book, a ribbon for her hair, a token that spoke of his growing admiration. To her, they were gestures of kindness. To him, they were the opening moves in a lifelong game. Their conversations were simple at first: books, school, dreams of distant places, but beneath the simplicity lurked a depth of emotion that neither could fully articulate. Pablo was patient, observing the smallest reactions, noting the curve of her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her family, her hopes, her fears. In return, María Victoria found herself drawn to his intensity, the fire that seemed to burn behind his calm exterior. There was a thrill in being near him, an inexplicable pull that left her both exhilarated and cautious. As their bond strengthened, whispers began to circle the town. People noticed how Pablo lingered where she was, how his presence seemed to command attention, yet he never imposed. Some admired his devotion, while others whispered warnings, sensing the danger inherent in a love that defied social norms. But Pablo was undeterred. Love, he believed, was a force more potent than any fear, and he intended to claim it slowly and surely. Their secret meetings became the pulse of his days. In the quiet corners of Medellin where no eyes could pry, they shared stolen moments, soft laughter, gentle touches, fleeting confessions. Each encounter etched itself into the memory of both young hearts, a mosaic of innocence and awakening desire. Pablo's intensity fascinated María Victoria. She had never met anyone who could ignite such powerful emotions, someone who could be both tender and commanding at once. And though a shadow of unease lingered, aware of the age difference, aware of the world's expectations, she could not deny the thrill that surged through her whenever he was near. The city, bustling and indifferent, held no judgment in those fleeting moments. Time itself seemed to bend around their meetings, stretching minutes into hours. For Pablo, every smile, every whispered word, every hesitant brush of fingers was a revelation. He began to envision a future where this young girl, with her unassuming charm and quiet strength, would become the center of his world, the anchor in the storm of ambitions that already stirred in his mind. And María Victoria, despite the innocence of her youth, felt the same inexorable pull, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and the first pangs of a love that would define her entire life. Yet even as their hearts intertwined, the undercurrent of danger lurked unseen. Pablo's ambitions, the subtle schemes and dreams of power, were seeds planted deep within him, waiting to grow into something that would one day threaten everything they held dear. But in these early days, in the stolen glances and whispered words, there was only the magic of discovery, the intoxicating thrill of first love, and the undeniable certainty that neither of them would ever be the same again. And so, in the quiet corners of Medellin, where the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the streets, two souls began a journey neither fully understood, a journey that would be marked by passion, peril, and a love so intense that it would shape the destiny of a man who would one day command the attention of the world, for both the greatness of his power and the darkness of his heart. By the time Pablo Escobar had begun to carve his name into the underworld of Medellin, the city had already become both his playground and his battlefield. The young man who once lingered nervously on sunlit streets now walked with a quiet, magnetic authority that demanded attention wherever he went. And yet, amid the rising chaos of his ambitions, his heart remained tethered to Maria Victoria, whose presence had become the calm center in the whirlwind of his life. Their love, however, had already begun to transform. No longer merely innocent and shy, it was infused with the intensity of a man whose ambitions knew no bounds. Pablo's world had expanded rapidly. Small deals had become large shipments, whispers had become threats, and every step forward in his empire carried the risk of blood. But within this storm, his love for Maria Victoria was steadfast, or at least it appeared so. He lavished her with extravagant gifts, pearls, silk scarves, small luxuries that contrasted sharply with the gritty reality outside their doors. The wealth he was amassing was meant to impress, to bind her heart even tighter to his, a tangible proof that the life he could offer was unlike any other. Yet as his power grew, so too did the complexities of desire. It was impossible for Pablo to confine himself to a single attachment, as his charisma drew others into his orbit with an almost predatory magnetism. One of the first of these was Virginia Vallejo, a young journalist whose curiosity about the world and audacity in pursuing truth intrigued him. Their meetings began innocently enough, with conversations about Colombia, politics, and culture, but quickly developed into something much more perilous. Virginia was drawn to the danger that clung to him like a shadow. She felt alive in a way she never had before. And Pablo, ever the enigma, found in her a mirror of his own ambition, a thrill that coexisted uneasily with the love he bore Maria Victoria. The juxtaposition of these relationships created a constant tension within him. With Maria Victoria, there was the comfort of trust, the quiet warmth of shared history. With Virginia, there was fire, the kind of reckless passion that made him feel invincible. In the privacy of dimly lit rooms, their encounters were electric. Whispered promises, daring touches, and the intoxicating mix of lust and power. Yet Pablo was careful, always calculating, always aware that one misstep could unravel everything he had built. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to grow darker. Rivals, envious of his meteoric rise, lurked in every alley, every street corner. Law enforcement's shadow grew longer by the day, and the violence that had once seemed distant now crept closer to his doorstep. Pablo's love for Maria Victoria became intertwined with a fierce need to protect, to shield her from the storm that raged beyond the walls of their home. He became obsessively attentive, ensuring her safety, monitoring her surroundings, and wrapping their home in layers of secrecy and security that were as much a shield as they were a testament to his control. And yet, even in this tense environment, moments of tenderness shone through. He would surprise her with private dinners atop rooftops overlooking the city, where the lights of Medellin twinkled like scattered stars. He would speak softly, his usual intensity giving way to a gentler cadence, and for a brief moment it felt as if the empire he was building could coexist with the life he shared with her. The stolen hours of laughter, the fleeting touches, the quiet confessions, these were the threads that held the fragile fabric of their love together, even as the world threatened to tear it apart. But Pablo's dual life was a delicate balancing act. Each step deeper into the drug trade increased the risk of exposure, betrayal, and violence. Every romantic entanglement was a potential spark for scandal, every act of passion a potential threat to the family he claimed to protect. The stakes were impossibly high, yet he seemed almost intoxicated by the danger, thriving in the tension between desire and peril. As the months turned into years, Pablo's identity became inseparable from the empire he was constructing. Love, ambition, and danger wove together into a tapestry as intricate as it was unstable. He was a man driven by extremes, capable of tenderness and brutality, generosity and ruthlessness, devotion and infidelity. In the midst of this, Maria Victoria remained his anchor, the one constant in a life defined by unpredictability. But even she began to sense the fractures forming, the inevitable collisions between love, loyalty, and the unstoppable force of a man determined to conquer everything in his path. Passion between Pablo and Virginia, meanwhile, grew bolder, unchecked by the moral or social constraints that governed most lives. They met in hidden apartments, in quiet corners of bustling cafes, and during clandestine trips that offered the thrill of escape and the danger of discovery. Every encounter was a blend of excitement and fear, the knowledge that their connection existed on the edge of catastrophe making it all the more irresistible. Pablo, ever the strategist, ensured that these escapades never compromised his primary relationship, but the tension was palpable, and the seeds of jealousy and heartache were quietly taking root. Thus, the young man who had once been merely ambitious was now fully ensnared in a web of power, passion, and peril. His love for Maria Victoria remained true in its own way, yet it was constantly tested by the dangerous allure of desire and the unrelenting pull of ambition. In those early years, as his empire expanded and his influence grew, Pablo learned a vital lesson, that love and power could coexist, but only if wielded with cunning, precision, and an almost ruthless control of one's own impulses. By the time the city began to take notice of his growing influence, Pablo Escobar had already become a man of contradictions, tender and dangerous, devoted and unfaithful, passionate and calculating. The stage was set for the ultimate test, one that would challenge not only his love but his very survival. For in the world he was building, every choice carried consequences, and the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and the fragile hearts caught in between. By now, Pablo Escobar's world was no longer confined to the quiet streets of Medellin. The empire he had painstakingly built was a force of nature, spreading through the city and beyond, leaving both awe and fear in its wake. And with this power came an inevitable shadow, a darkness that reached into every corner of his life, including the most intimate one, love. Maria Victoria remained at the heart of his existence, the anchor to a man whose life seemed constantly on the brink of chaos. Yet the bond they shared was increasingly tested by the demands of his empire. The drug trade was no longer just a game of cunning. It had become a battlefield, with rivals lurking in every alley and betrayal waiting in every handshake. Pablo's once playful charm had hardened into a vigilant, calculating vigilance. Every step outside their home carried risk, and every smile exchanged within it was tinged with the knowledge that danger was never far away. It was in this maelstrom of ambition and peril that Virginia Vallejo entered his life. A young journalist with sharp intelligence and a fearless curiosity, she was captivated by the enigmatic figure of Pablo Escobar. Where others saw only power and menace, she glimpsed complexity, a man driven by passion and desire, capable of tenderness even amidst chaos. Their first encounters were casual, professional even, but there was an undeniable tension, a spark that neither could ignore. Conversations about politics, society, and culture became charged with subtle glances and lingering touches, a dance of intellect and desire. Pablo found in Virginia a mirror of his own intensity. With her, he could explore facets of himself that Maria Victoria could not access, the reckless thrill of temptation, the intoxicating blend of attraction and danger. Their relationship unfolded in the shadows. Clandestine meetings in dimly lit cafes, whispered confessions during late-night drives through the city, and stolen moments in luxurious apartments where the world outside seemed to vanish. It was a dangerous game, each encounter a risk, yet the exhilaration only heightened the intensity of their connection. Meanwhile, the pressures of his empire seeped into every aspect of his personal life. Rivals became more aggressive, law enforcement more determined, and the constant threat of violence cast a long shadow over even the simplest gestures of affection. Pablo's love for Maria Victoria became a delicate balance between devotion and obsession. He monitored her movements, ensured her safety with layers of secrecy, and enveloped her in gestures of luxury and attention that were as much about protection as they were about passion. Yet the specter of his infidelities loomed large, creating tension that neither time nor wealth could fully erase. In these years, the duality of Pablo's existence became starkly apparent. With Maria Victoria, there was warmth, history, and a sense of enduring commitment. With Virginia, there was fire, unpredictability, and a thrill that bordered on recklessness. Navigating this duality required constant vigilance. One misstep could shatter the delicate equilibrium he maintained. And yet, the risk itself seemed to fuel him, reinforcing the intensity with which he pursued both love and power. The violence surrounding his empire also began to intrude more directly into his domestic life. Messages of threats, the rumble of rival cartels, and sudden unpredictable acts of aggression created an atmosphere of perpetual tension. Even simple outings required careful planning, and every interaction with the outside world was tinged with the possibility of disaster. In this environment, love became both a refuge and a battleground, a source of solace and a reminder of everything he stood to lose. Amidst this chaos, moments of tenderness remained, fleeting yet profound. Pablo would orchestrate secret evenings for Maria Victoria, where the world outside their home disappeared into shadows and whispers. They would speak of dreams, of future children, of a life unburdened by crime, though they both knew such fantasies were fleeting. With Virginia, the intensity was different, urgent, passionate, and tinged with danger. Each meeting was a surrender to desire, a brief escape from the responsibilities and fears that consumed his waking life. The psychological tension of managing both relationships, combined with the ever-present threat of violence, began to take its toll. Pablo oscillated between moments of intense affection and periods of brooding contemplation, aware that any lapse could have catastrophic consequences. Maria Victoria, perceptive and resilient, sensed the growing strain but remained loyal, caught in a web of love, fear, and devotion. Virginia, enthralled by the danger and the charisma of Pablo, was both muse and mirror, reflecting the man he had become, a man defined by extremes, living constantly on the edge. This period of Escobar's life was marked by a cruel irony. The very qualities that drew women to him, his passion, his intelligence, his magnetism, were inseparable from the violence and chaos that threatened to destroy everything he loved. The stakes of romance were amplified by the stakes of survival, creating a tension so intense that every smile, every touch, every whispered word was charged with unspoken risk. Love was no longer merely a source of joy. It had become a weapon, a shield, and a liability all at once. In the shadow of violence, the hearts of all involved beat faster, sharpened by fear, excitement, and desire. Pablo Escobar, the man who would become one of the most feared figures in history, was at once tender and ruthless, devoted and unfaithful, a lover and a predator. The duality of his life created a volatile mix, ensuring that no one, not even the woman who had been with him from the beginning, could ever feel completely safe, completely certain, or completely loved. Yet despite the tension, despite the danger, love persisted, intense, unrelenting, and irrevocably bound to the perilous world he had chosen to inhabit. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar's empire had grown into a sprawling, nearly unstoppable force. Medellin bowed under his influence, while his rivals plotted in the shadows. Law enforcement sharpened its focus, and the violence surrounding him intensified. But in the midst of this chaos, it was the turbulence of the heart that would become his most perilous battlefield. Maria Victoria had remained steadfast through the early years of Pablo's rise, enduring the lavish gifts, the whispered promises, and the constant undercurrent of danger. Yet even her enduring loyalty could not fully shield her from the emotional fractures forming within their relationship. The presence of Virginia Vallejo was no longer a secret to anyone who paid attention, and the tension it created was both subtle and suffocating. The moments of tenderness Pablo once shared with Maria Victoria were now punctuated by his absence, distracted glances, and the knowledge that his attention was being divided in ways that threatened to unravel their fragile intimacy. The first serious confrontation came one night in their secluded home, a residence fortified against threats both known and unseen. Maria Victoria's voice trembled with restrained fury as she confronted him about the rumors, about the whispers of another woman who had stolen hours, if not days, of his time. Pablo, ever confident, attempted to soothe her anger with carefully chosen words and gestures, but the tension between them was a palpable, living thing. Pressed against the walls, it lingered in the air, it seeped into every corner of their shared life. No amount of wealth, no display of power could erase the sting of betrayal from the heart. Virginia, meanwhile, was exhilarated by the danger of their secret. Every meeting was charged with adrenaline, every touch a rebellion against the constraints of morality and expectation. She was enthralled by Pablo's duality, the tender lover, the ruthless kingpin, and she found herself drawn deeper into a world that oscillated between lavish romance and lethal peril. Their love, or whatever mixture of passion and desire it truly was, became a force of nature, consuming time, attention, and emotional energy. Yet even as Pablo reveled in this fiery connection, he could not escape the consequences. The strain on Maria Victoria was tangible, and her trust was eroding with each passing day. The empire itself contributed to the heartbreak. Rivals attacked with increasing ferocity, and the city became a stage for violence that seeped into the domestic sphere. Every missed dinner, every unexplained absence, every hurried trip for business was an emotional landmine. Pablo's attempts to manage both his criminal empire and his personal relationships created cracks that no amount of charm could conceal. The delicate balance of love, power, and desire was beginning to tip dangerously toward disaster. It was during this period that the true cost of his dual life became painfully clear. Maria Victoria, resilient though she was, began to withdraw, the hurt accumulating behind a carefully maintained facade of composure. She loved him, yes, but love could not erase the sting of betrayal, nor could it prevent the anxiety that came with the constant threat of violence that stalked their family. Pablo, for all his genius and ambition, could not control the consequences of his own passions. The world he had built, rich, intoxicating, and dangerous, was beginning to encroach upon the very thing he claimed to hold most dear, the woman who had been with him from the beginning. Tension reached a climax one night when a misstep nearly turned tragic. A rival faction, aware of Pablo's vulnerabilities, attempted an attack that brought the danger of his empire into the sanctuary of his home. Maria Victoria, terrified and shaking, confronted him not just with anger but with a desperate plea for protection and reassurance. In that moment, the boundaries between love, fear, and betrayal blurred. Pablo's response was both calculated and impulsive. He neutralized the immediate threat with cold efficiency, yet the emotional fallout lingered like a wound that refused to heal. The event crystallized a harsh truth. Love in his world could not exist without danger, and every act of passion carried a shadow of potential destruction. Meanwhile, the affair with Virginia grew increasingly perilous. The secrecy that once provided excitement now threatened exposure, and Pablo's careful balancing act became untenable. Miscommunication, jealousy, and suspicion added layers of complication, creating a triangle fraught with tension and resentment. Maria Victoria, though deeply loyal, could sense the shifting dynamics, while Virginia began to question the limits of Pablo's devotion. The emotional stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of any misstep could reverberate far beyond the confines of the heart. And yet, despite the heartbreak, despite the betrayals and the ever-present threat of violence, Pablo remained undeterred. His love, in whatever form it took, was inseparable from his identity. He was a man who demanded intensity, who thrived on extremes, and who believed that passion, no matter how destructive, was a necessary component of life. The interplay of love and danger, tenderness and ruthlessness, devotion and betrayal, had become the defining pattern of his existence. In these years, the lessons of power and passion intertwined. Pablo Escobar learned that love could be both a refuge and a battlefield, that loyalty could be tested in ways unimaginable, and that the human heart was as vulnerable as it was resilient. Betrayal and heartbreak were not mere consequences of his choices. They were integral to the complex tapestry of his life, woven alongside ambition, danger, and desire. And in the shadows of these experiences, the stage was set for the next chapter, where love, loss, and the relentless pursuit of power would collide with even greater intensity. By the late 1980s, Pablo Escobar's empire had reached its terrifying zenith. Medellin bowed under his influence, while the Colombian government, aided by international forces, intensified the hunt for him. The empire he had painstakingly built now threatened to consume everything he held dear, including the fragile bonds of love that had once anchored his life. Maria Victoria, though fiercely loyal, began to experience the crushing weight of living beside a man whose life was defined by danger, duplicity, and power. Each day brought new threats, new acts of violence, and the constant reminder that their world could collapse at any moment. Her heart, once filled with youthful devotion, now wrestled with fear and disillusionment. She watched Pablo oscillate between moments of tenderness and bouts of ruthless aggression, the duality of his nature growing more pronounced with each passing year. The affair with Virginia Vallejo had reached a fevered pitch. Their secret meetings were charged with an intensity that bordered on obsession, each encounter a mixture of desire and peril. Pablo's duplicity strained the limits of human emotion, and Virginia herself began to sense the fragility of their arrangement. She was enthralled by the danger, yet acutely aware that her position was precarious. The thrill of their liaison existed alongside the knowledge that love in Pablo's world was never simple or safe. The erosion of trust between Pablo and Maria Victoria became undeniable. Arguments erupted over his absences, his infidelities, and the impossible demands of his empire. Times, Pablo's attempts at reconciliation, lavish gifts, grand declarations of love, carefully orchestrated evenings, were met with silence, with the cold distance of a woman who had begun to question whether survival could coexist with love. Each reconciliation was temporary, a fragile bridge over waters darkened by betrayal and fear. As the net of law enforcement tightened, the violence around him escalated. Friends and rivals alike were eliminated in public displays of brutality, each act a warning and a demonstration of power. Maria Victoria and their children were not immune. The threat of abduction, retaliation, and collateral harm became a daily reality. In the face of this, her loyalty was tested to its limits. She could love him, yes, but the human cost of that love had begun to weigh unbearably on her spirit. In these years, Pablo began to grasp the full cost of his choices. The duality of love and desire, the interplay of loyalty and betrayal, and the constant specter of death had transformed every intimate moment into a gamble. He became increasingly isolated, recognizing that his world of opulence and power had erected barriers even around the people he most cherished. Maria Victoria's growing distance, Virginia's cautious intensity, and the omnipresent danger all forced him into moments of reflection that were rare, fleeting, and tinged with regret. Tragic climax arrived with a series of events that left no room for denial. Close allies were murdered, rivals escalated their attacks, and law enforcement's grip grew ever tighter. Maria Victoria, exhausted by fear and heartbreak, began to withdraw emotionally, creating a chasm that even Pablo's charisma could not bridge. Virginia, sensing the inevitable collapse of secrecy, retreated from the danger, leaving only the raw aftermath of passion and betrayal. For Pablo, the empire he had built and the love he had pursued were now intertwined in a cruel irony. The very power that had secured his desires had become the instrument of loss. The impact on his children was profound. Pablo's son and daughter witnessed the tension, the absence, and the fragmented attention that marked their father's life. They saw love and violence coexisting in ways incomprehensible to young hearts. In those moments, the cost of ambition became tangible, a lesson written not in words but in fear, longing, and absence. Amid the turbulence, Pablo clung to a dangerous belief that love, like power, could be wrested from chaos through control and audacity. Yet the lesson of these years was unavoidable. Love in the world he inhabited was fragile, vulnerable to betrayal, imperiled by violence, and perpetually at risk. Each embrace, each declaration, each moment of tenderness carried the shadow of loss, a reminder that even the most powerful man could not fully shield his heart or the hearts of those he loved from the consequences of his choices. The era of unchallenged dominance was ending. The walls of his empire were beginning to crack, and the echoes of betrayal, heartbreak, and loss reverberated through every intimate space he had once considered safe. Pablo Escobar, who had once believed himself invincible in both love and power, began to understand the profound fragility of human connection, even when fortified by wealth, influence, and fear. In these final years before his inevitable downfall, love was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield. Maria Victoria's loyalty remained, tempered by fear and sorrow. Virginia's passion receded into memory, leaving scars as vivid as they were invisible. And Pablo, ever the man of extremes, faced the ultimate reckoning, that no empire, no matter how vast, could protect him from the heartbreak he had sown, nor could it shield him from the consequences of a life lived at the intersection of love, desire, and relentless ambition. The stage was set for the final act. With enemies closing in, law enforcement tightening its grip, and the very foundations of his empire trembling, Pablo faced the ultimate question. Could love survive when the world itself had become an unrelenting storm? The answer, as the final chapter would reveal, was as tragic as it was inevitable, a culmination of passion, power, and the unyielding force of destiny. The dawn of the 1990s brought no reprieve for Pablo Escobar. The walls of his empire, once impenetrable, were closing in, besieged by law enforcement, rivals, and the weight of his own choices. Medellin was no longer a city of possibility. It was a city of consequence, where every decision carried the shadow of death. And yet, even as the world outside crumbled, the matters of the heart remained his most ungovernable battlefield. Maria Victoria had endured more than anyone could reasonably bear. Years of fear, betrayal, and uncertainty had tempered her once innocent devotion into a complex blend of love, resilience, and sorrow. She had navigated the labyrinth of his passions, his dangerous liaisons, and the constant threat of violence with a steadfast courage that belied her youth. Now, as Pablo's power waned and danger loomed ever closer, she found herself carrying not just her own survival but that of their children, Hugo and Manuela, on shoulders strengthened by necessity and tempered by love. For Pablo, the collapse of his empire was both external and internal. Rivals closed in from all sides, law enforcement intensified its pursuit, and betrayals from within left him increasingly isolated. Yet it was the fragility of human connection, the love he had taken for granted and the loyalty he had tested, that cut deepest. Maria Victoria's quiet strength became a mirror to his own vulnerabilities, revealing a man who had wielded power with audacity but had neglected the most tender of bonds. Virginia Vallejo's departure had left echoes of passion and regret, a reminder that even the most intense desires could not survive without trust and care. The final days were a brutal symphony of strategy, fear, and fleeting reflection. Pablo moved like a shadow through Medellin, avoiding capture, negotiating alliances, and contemplating the life he had built, both its grandeur and its horrors. Amid the chaos, moments of introspection revealed a man who understood at last that the most precious treasures of his life were not the wealth he had amassed, nor the fear he inspired, but the fragile bonds of love and family that had sustained him in fleeting moments of peace. Maria Victoria, ever vigilant, safeguarded the children with a fierce determination born of necessity. She navigated the treacherous landscape of loyalty and danger, teaching them survival without extinguishing the remnants of innocence. Her love, tested to its limits, became a silent testament to the endurance of the human heart. She understood that Pablo's life, for all its passion and brilliance, was a cautionary tale, a narrative in which love and destruction were inexorably entwined. And then, as the net finally closed, the inevitable occurred. Pablo Escobar was cornered, hunted, and ultimately struck down by the forces he had long defied. His death, violent and sudden, was both the end of an era and the liberation of those he loved. For Maria Victoria and their children, it marked the beginning of a life reclaimed, though forever shadowed by the memory of a man whose passions had been as grand as his crimes. The aftermath was a delicate, painful reconstruction of life. Wealth and power, once so central, became meaningless relics. Love endured, but it was transformed, tempered by the lessons of survival and the harsh realities of loss. Maria Victoria guided the children into a world where the echoes of their father's brilliance and brutality could coexist with safety, hope, and the possibility of ordinary happiness. In reflecting on Pablo's life, one sees a man defined by extremes, capable of extraordinary tenderness and unspeakable violence, of passion and cruelty, devotion and betrayal. His story is a cautionary testament to the duality of human nature, the way love can flourish alongside obsession, how desire can coexist with danger, and how the pursuit of power can amplify both the noblest and darkest impulses of the heart. The legacy of his love, therefore, is as complex as the man himself. Maria Victoria's endurance, the children's resilience, and the indelible mark of passion and intensity that Pablo left behind form a narrative that is neither purely tragic nor wholly redemptive. It is instead profoundly human, a reminder that even amidst darkness and violence, love, frail, tumultuous, and imperfect, remains a force capable of shaping destinies, inspiring courage, and leaving traces that outlast the fleeting power of wealth, fear, and ambition. In the end, Pablo Escobar's life was a study in contrasts. Empire and intimacy, devotion and betrayal, violence and tenderness, they existed side by side, inseparable and unrelenting. His love for Maria Victoria, his passion for Virginia, and his care for his children were all tempered by the realities of a life lived on the edge, where every heartbeat carried the weight of both desire and danger. And while the world remembers him for the power he wielded and the fear he inspired, the echoes of his heart, its passions, mistakes, and enduring attachments, remain a testament to the complexity of a man who lived, loved, and fell with unparalleled intensity.